Somewhere in the wetlands of northern Europe, a man died. That's not unusual. People die all the time in every era on every continent. What's unusual is what happened next. Instead of decomposing, instead of returning to dust the way every living thing eventually does, his body was swallowed whole by a bog, and it stayed there. For 2,400 years, the earth held him like a secret. And when workers finally pulled him out of the ground in 1950, he looked less like an ancient corpse, and less like something dug from a museum case, and more like someone who had simply fallen asleep in the mud. His skin was intact, his stubble was still visible, and coiled around his neck, still tight, still unmistakably intentional, was a rope. Think about that for a second. A rope, still around his neck, after 2.5 millennia. This is Tollen Man, found in a peat bog in Denmark, and he is one of the most extraordinary, most unsettling, most scientifically valuable human remains ever recovered anywhere on Earth. A body that by every rule of biology and chemistry simply should not exist. Soft tissue doesn't survive 2,000 years in open ground. Skin doesn't survive. Organs don't survive. And yet here he was, preserved in such extraordinary detail that the first people to find him didn't call archaeologists. They called the police because they thought they were looking at a recent murder victim. They were not wrong about the murder part. But here's where it gets complicated, and here's where this story becomes something more than just a remarkable act of preservation. Because the rope tells us something. The deliberately placed rope around a man's neck in a remote bog 2,400 years ago tells us that his death was not an accident. It was not illness. It was not some unlucky fall into the wetland. Someone put that rope there. Someone tightened it. And the question of why, the question of who this man was and what he meant to the people who killed him, that question has been driving historians, archaeologists, and forensic scientists absolutely mad for more than 70 years. Was he a criminal? A prisoner executed by an Iron Age society that had very clear ideas about punishment? Was he a sacrifice, offered to the gods that these ancient people believed lived in the dark, still water of the bogs? Was he something else entirely, something that doesn't fit cleanly into either category? The honest answer, the careful answer, is that we don't fully know. And that tension between what the science can tell us with confidence and what remains genuinely, hauntingly uncertain is exactly what makes Tollen Man so compelling. If you're watching this late at night or during a commute or somewhere, you shouldn't probably be watching videos right now. I'm curious where you are. Drop a comment telling me your location and what time it is there. I read them, and it's always this strange, beautiful thing seeing someone in Tokyo at midnight next to someone in Chicago at lunch, all watching the same ancient face, all asking the same questions, because those questions matter. They're not just about one man in one bog in one corner of Iron Age Denmark. They're about how societies decide who lives and who dies, about what people in the past believed was sacred and what they believed was monstrous, and sometimes how those two things overlapped, about what we owe to the dead when science gives us the power to read their final hours like an open book. Here's what we're going to do. We'll start with the discovery itself, because the story of how Tollen Man was found is almost as strange as the story of how he died. Then we'll get into the science of bog preservation, because understanding why his body survived is the key to understanding everything else about him. From there we'll look at the man himself in detail, his age, his health, his last meal, the extraordinary forensic picture that modern technology has assembled from his remains. Then we'll zoom out to the world he lived in, Iron Age Denmark, the beliefs and rituals and social structures that produced a death like this. And finally, we'll face the hardest question head on. What exactly happened to Tollen Man, and can we ever know for certain? 2,400 years of silence. One rope. Let's figure out what it's trying to tell us. It's May 1950. The landscape around Bjelskovdal, a few miles west of the town of Silkeborg in central Denmark, looks the way it has looked for thousands of years. Flat, dark, wet. Stretching out in every direction, the bog is a strange, almost lunar terrain, covered in low heather and sphagnum moss, punctuated by shallow pools of black water that reflect the sky like broken mirrors. It's not a place that invites you in. It's a place that watches you from a distance. But people have been coming here for centuries anyway, because beneath the surface of that forbidding landscape lies something valuable. Peat. Compressed, decomposed plant matter that has been building up layer by layer for thousands of years, and when you cut it into blocks and let it dry, it burns, slowly, steadily, with a thick, earthy smoke that settles into everything. In rural Denmark, particularly in the post-war years when fuel was still precious and coal still expensive, peat cutting was not a hobby, it was work. Seasonal, physical, necessary work that put heat in homes through long Scandinavian winters. So on the 8th of May, two brothers named Viggo and Emil Højgaard went out to the bog to cut peat. This was ordinary, this was routine. They had done it before, their fathers had done it before them, and the bog had given up nothing more remarkable than dirt and the occasional root. They were using the traditional tools, long spades and cutters designed to slice cleanly through the dense, dark layers, working their way methodically through the surface, stacking blocks to dry. Just work, just a Tuesday. And then one of them saw something that wasn't peat. It was a face, not immediately recognizable as a face, not at first. When you're cutting through dark, compressed organic material in a boggy trench, your brain is not primed to see a human being. It's primed to see roots, rocks, old wood, the occasional animal bone. So the first glimpse is more like a wrongness, a shape that doesn't belong, a texture that is somehow different from everything around it. And then your eyes adjust and the pattern resolves and you realize you're looking at skin, at a forehead, at closed eyes. The two brothers stopped. They looked at what they had found. And then they did exactly what almost everyone who has ever discovered a body in a remote place does. They called the police. This is a pattern that repeats itself across nearly every bog body discovery in Northern Europe. The finders assume recent death. They assume crime, accident, something that belongs to the present. Because the bodies don't look ancient. They look wrong in the way that a person who has just drowned looks wrong, not in the way that a skeleton or a mummy looks wrong. There's still a face there. There are still features. And the human brain is extraordinarily sensitive to human faces. It recognizes them even when it shouldn't, even when they're 2,500 years old and buried under 4 feet of peat. The police arrived from Silkeborg. They looked at what the brothers had uncovered, and to their credit, someone among them was sharp enough to recognize that this did not look like any recent death they had ever investigated. The preservation was too extreme, too complete. The darkness of the skin was not the darkness of decomposition. It was something else. They called in a specialist, Professor P.V. Glob from Aarhus University, one of the leading archaeologists in Denmark, a man who had seen bog bodies before and understood what they meant. Glob arrived and immediately recognized what he was dealing with, and here is where the story becomes something other than a simple discovery narrative, because the next decision was absolutely critical. The instinct when you find something remarkable in the ground is to get it out, to hold it, examine it, bring it somewhere safe. That instinct is almost always wrong. Once you remove an object from its context, you lose information that can never be recovered. The position of a body in a grave tells you things. The exact layer of soil around it tells you things. What's in the surrounding peat, what plant materials are present, what the water chemistry is, all of that is evidence, and all of it is connected to where the object lies in the ground. Glob and his team documented everything before they moved anything. They photographed the site in exhaustive detail. They recorded the precise depth at which the body was found, the orientation of the head, the position of the limbs as they gradually revealed them. They noted which direction the body was facing, what was immediately beneath it and above it, whether there were any objects nearby that might have been placed there deliberately. They were treating the bog not just as the place where the body happened to end up, but as the site of a deliberate act that they needed to understand on its own terms. Because here's something that experienced archaeologists had already begun to understand by 1950. These bog bodies were not accidents. They were not people who had wandered into a wetland on a dark night and fallen in. The bogs of northern Europe had given up dozens of human remains over the centuries, and a pattern had emerged. The bodies were typically found in particular kinds of bogs. They were often found at specific depths that corresponded to specific historical periods. They were often naked or nearly so. They often showed signs of violence, and they were almost never accompanied by the kind of personal possessions, tools, jewellery, weapons that you would expect if someone had simply drowned while going about their daily life. The bog was not just a grave. It was a location that had been chosen. When they finally lifted Tolland Man from the peat, he came out with the surrounding material still clinging to him, dark and dense and wet. The team worked carefully, using their hands as much as any tool, conscious that the body was both extraordinarily well preserved and extraordinarily fragile. The preservation that the bog provided depended on specific conditions, and those conditions were about to change the moment the body hit open air. Oxygen, temperature changes, bacteria, light, all of it could begin the process of decay that had been suspended for 24 centuries. They had a narrow window. What they carried out of that bog was something that defied easy categorization. It was not a skeleton. It was not a mummy in the conventional desiccated sense. It was a body. A man curled slightly on his side, his leather cap still on his head, his eyes closed, his expression composed in a way that has disturbed and fascinated everyone who has seen photographs of him ever since. He looks peaceful. He looks like he's sleeping. And around his neck, visible once they had cleared enough of the surrounding peat, was the plaited leather rope, still knotted, still tight, still exactly where someone had placed it more than 2,000 years ago. Think about what the bog had done. It had received this man, and it had held him. Not just the hard parts, the bones, the teeth, the material that survives almost everywhere. It had held the soft parts, the skin, the internal organs, the contents of his stomach, which were still there, still analyzable, still capable of telling scientists what he had eaten on the last day of his life. The bog had done something that no tomb, no pyramid, no deliberate act of preservation by any ancient culture had managed to achieve with ordinary human remains. It had stopped time. That is not a metaphor. The biochemistry of what happened in that bog, the specific combination of cold, acidity, and oxygen deprivation that had held Tolland Man in suspension, had genuinely arrested the processes of decay. Every year that passed, every century, the layers of peat above him had grown deeper. The pressure had increased. The seal had become more complete. He had been locked in a kind of amber, organic and dark and unremarkable from the surface, holding a secret that nobody walking across those flat Danish wetlands could have guessed was there. And now he was out. And the questions were beginning. Who was he? How did he die? Why was he here, in this particular bog, in this particular spot at the end of a rope? The discovery itself was only the beginning of a process that is, in some ways, still unfolding. Because modern science keeps finding new ways to ask questions of the dead, and Tolland Man, patient and still and astonishingly preserved, keeps finding new ways to answer. To understand what the bog did to Tolland Man, you have to understand what a bog actually is. Not just a wet, dark patch of ground, but a specific kind of ecosystem with its own chemistry, its own geology, its own peculiar relationship with time. It starts with sphagnum moss, that low, dense, water-saturated plant that carpets the surface of northern European wetlands, has been doing something quietly remarkable for thousands of years. When sphagnum dies, it doesn't fully decompose. It sinks to the bottom of the shallow water and compresses. Layer by layer, year by year, millennium by millennium, the dead moss accumulates into peat, a dense, dark, waterlogged matrix that can build up at a rate of roughly a millimetre per year. A bog that's a few metres deep might represent 5,000 or 10,000 years of continuous accumulation, and within that accumulation, almost no oxygen. That last part is the key to everything. Decay, the process by which organic matter breaks down after death, is fundamentally biological. Bacteria and fungi consume dead tissue, digesting proteins and fats and carbohydrates, reducing complex structures to simple molecules and eventually to nothing. But those bacteria and fungi need oxygen to do their work. In normal soil, air moves through the spaces between particles. Oxygen is available. Decomposition proceeds efficiently. A human body buried in ordinary soil is typically reduced to bone within a few decades. In a bog, there is almost no oxygen. The water is stagnant, the peat is dense, and the moss itself actively consumes what little oxygen exists. You drop something organic into a bog, and the bacteria responsible for decay find themselves in an environment where they simply cannot function. The chemistry required for decomposition stalls. The body sits. But oxygen deprivation alone wouldn't produce what happened to Tolland Man. If it were just a matter of keeping bacteria away, You'd expect the body to remain more or less unchanged, a kind of suspended wet softness. What you actually find in bog bodies is something more extreme and more strange. The skin is dark, leathery, tanned in the most literal sense of that word. This is where sphagnum moss does something that nobody who hasn't studied it would ever expect. Living sphagnum releases a compound called sphagnum, a complex polysaccharide that reacts with nitrogen in the surrounding water, pulling it out of solution and making it unavailable to bacteria. And as peat accumulates, the bog water becomes increasingly acidic, dropping to a pH that most microorganisms cannot tolerate. Add to this the cold temperatures of northern European wetlands, where the water just a metre or two below the surface remains close to freezing even in summer, and you have created something functionally equivalent to a tanning vat. The organic acids in the bog water actually cross-link the proteins in skin, converting them from soft, vulnerable tissue into something more durable, more resistant, more like leather. The same process that a traditional tanner uses to convert animal hide into usable material is happening slowly, across decades, in the peat around a human body. This is why Tollund man's skin survived. It wasn't preserved passively, it was chemically transformed into something that could outlast the centuries. But here's the paradox. The same acidity that preserves soft tissue is actively hostile to calcium, and bones are made largely of calcium phosphate. In many bog bodies, archaeologists have found something that seems counterintuitive at first. The skin is intact, the hair is present, sometimes even the fingerprints are legible, but the skeleton beneath has partially dissolved. The bones have been leached of minerals, leaving behind something more like cartilage than bone, flexible and softened. In extreme cases, the skeleton is barely present at all. The bog preserves the outside of the person, while quietly destroying the structural framework within. For Tollund man, this has had real consequences. The bones are there but weakened. Detailed skeletal analysis has been complicated by the distortions that occurred over 2,000 years of compression under layers of accumulating peat. The body that came out of the bog in 1950 was both more and less than a skeleton would have been. More in terms of what was preserved, less in terms of certain structural information that calcium-rich bone would normally provide. What the bog did preserve, alongside the skin, is extraordinary. Hair survives almost perfectly in peat environments. Tollund man's short, stubbled hair was clearly visible when he was uncovered. The leather cap he was wearing was intact, the stitching legible, the shape maintained. The rope around his neck was complete. Stomach contents, which decompose rapidly under normal conditions and are almost never recoverable from ancient remains, were preserved in a form that could be analysed in a laboratory. This matters enormously, because each of these categories of evidence tells you something different. Skin can tell you about injury, about rope marks, about the physical circumstances of death. Hair can tell you about age and stress, and with modern analysis about diet and geography. Clothing and objects tell you about culture and period, and stomach contents, the last meal, tell you about the final hours of a person's life in a way that almost no other evidence can approach. But it's important to be precise about what preservation can and cannot tell us. The bog does not preserve everything equally. Internal organs exist but are often compressed beyond easy examination. The brain may survive in partial form. Blood type can sometimes be determined from soft tissue, but the processes of decomposition, even in a bog, are not uniformly arrested. They are slowed, altered, rerouted. Some information survives in extraordinary detail. Other information degrades in ways that are irreversible, which means that even Tollund man, the best preserved bog body ever recovered, does not yield his secrets easily. The rope around his neck is real. The evidence of what it did to his body is real. But the question of why it was placed there, the meaning behind the act, the intention of the people who carried it out, Those things are not preserved in the peat. Those things have to be reconstructed from everything else we know, from the body, from the bog, from the world that existed around both of them 2,500 years ago. And that reconstruction starts with the man himself. When archaeologists and pathologists talk about Tolland man, they don't start with the rope. They start with the person you would have seen if you had somehow been there when he was lifted from the peat. Because before he was an archaeological specimen, before he was a mystery with a noose around his neck, he was a body lying in the bog with a face that looked, disturbingly, like he might wake up. The first thing that struck the people who found him was how peaceful he looked. His eyes were closed. His mouth was relaxed. The skin of his face, although darkened almost to the colour of mahogany, still carried the soft contours of someone asleep rather than someone violently killed. The wrinkles around the corners of his eyes, the slight crease between his brows, the curve of his lips, all of it was there in a way that is almost never preserved in ancient remains. His skin is one of the most striking features. Because of the tanning process in the bog, it shrank and tightened over time, adhering closely to the bone and soft tissue that remained. It looks tough, leathery, but the fine details are astonishing. You can still see pores, faint wrinkles, the subtle pattern of age that tells you he was not a teenager, not an old man, but somewhere in between. Later analysis of his skeleton suggested he was probably in his 40s. The skin reinforces that impression. Not youthful and smooth, not deeply lined, but lived in. His hair survived almost perfectly. Cut short, maybe a few centimetres long, it lies close to his scalp, a dark, fine stubble in its preserved state. Originally it was probably a light brown. The bog darkened it, but the texture remains. There is no elaborate hairstyle, no braids or ornaments, just a practical, trimmed cut that suggests routine maintenance rather than ritual display. It's one of those tiny details that makes him feel like a real person. Someone who, at some point not long before he died, sat while another pair of hands trimmed his hair to a neat, even length. Even his stubble survived. If you look closely at his chin and upper lip, you can see the faint suggestion of beard growth. He had shaved or been shaved not long before his death. The hairs had begun to grow back, but not much. That simple observation, that he probably did not go to the bog with a long, wild beard, says something about grooming habits, about appearance, about a world where people cared what they looked like even if they were about to die. His nails are there too, small, dark, flattened by time but recognizable. In life they would have been the ordinary nails of someone who worked with his hands. No elaborate decoration, no sign of having been carefully manicured for display. Nails can show certain diseases or chronic deficiencies, but in Tolland man's case nothing like that jumps out in the preserved material. What they mostly show is that he had hands, fingers, the same small anatomical details that you and I see every day when we look down. The bog did not erase that humanness. Then there is his face itself. The nose, though compressed, retains its general shape. The lips are slightly pursed, but not in a grimace. The eyelids have folded gently over the now absent eyeballs, giving the impression of calm rest. The cheeks, though thinned, still show their underlying structure. Taken together, these features are why so many people who see him, even in photographs, report the same reaction. He looks like someone you could talk to, but posture tells a different story. When he was found, Tolland man was lying slightly curled, on his side, legs drawn up, one arm bent. This is not the rigid, sprawled position you might associate with a body left where it fell. It looks, at first glance, almost like a sleeping pose. Knees slightly tucked, head gently inclined, hands close to the body. This apparent tranquility has led some observers, especially in the early years, to imagine that he might have been placed in the bog with care, almost tenderly. Yet posture in a bog body is a tricky thing. Over centuries, the weight of accumulating peat can shift limbs, compress spines, distort joints. The dissolving of bone can allow soft tissues to sag and settle in ways they never would in life. Some of his apparent serenity is real. His facial muscles really did relax in death. But some of his pose may be partly the result of slow deformation under pressure. That's why documentation at the moment of discovery matters so much. Photographs, sketches, measurements, They freeze that instant when the body emerges from the peat, before modern air and handling begin to alter it further, and this is where the rope becomes crucial. Around Tollenmann's neck is a plaited leather thong, tied into a carefully constructed noose with a knot positioned under his left ear. The loop lies high on his neck just under the jawline. Its position is not random. In cases of hanging, the placement of the knot and the angle of the rope can tell you a surprising amount about how the body was suspended, for how long, and what forces were applied. In Tollenmann's case, the rope sits in such a way that it seems to have encircled the neck snugly, but not chaotically. The noose is still tight. It did not slip loose in the bog. The furrow it left in his skin was visible when he was excavated. Radiographs and close examination suggest that the soft tissues of the neck show clear signs of constriction. But here again, you have to be careful. The same compression that preserved his skin also compressed his neck in general. Distinguishing between damage caused by the rope at the moment of death and distortions caused by centuries in the bog is not trivial. This is why detailed recording of the rope's exact position and the condition of the skin beneath it matters so much. A few centimeters of difference can change an interpretation from short drop hanging to strangulation while lying down. The angle of the knot can indicate whether the body was suspended or whether the rope was pulled tight by hand. We don't have every answer, but we do have enough to say that the rope was not a loose symbolic accessory. It interacted with his neck in a way that strongly suggests it was the means of killing him. When you look closer at the rest of his body, another layer of complexity emerges: damage. Some of it looks at first like evidence of terrible violence, limbs that seem out of alignment, joints that look dislocated, areas where the skin appears torn or separated. In another context, in a forensic case today, these might be read as blows, breaks, or post-mortem mutilation. But bogs are unforgiving environments for bone. As the calcium leaches out, bones soften and warp. The massive, slow pressure of peat can bend a femur or compress a spine. When the bog dries during excavation, shrunken skin can crack, revealing gaps that look like wounds but are really just the result of desiccation. In Tollenmann's case, careful study has suggested that many of the apparent injuries below the neck are not signs of torture or beating. They are post-depositional changes, damage inflicted by chemistry, pressure, and time. That doesn't mean he died gently. It means that the only unequivocal sign of lethal force we can point to with some confidence is the constriction around his neck. Bruising, internal bleeding, subtle fractures, the things a modern forensic pathologist would rely on to reconstruct a violent death, are largely unavailable or obscured. The bog preserved his surface, but it also erased much of the fine-grained evidence of what happened in his final minutes. Clothing adds another layer to the mystery. When Tollenmann was discovered, he was wearing a carefully made leather cap, fastened under his chin, and a belt around his waist. But apart from that, he was naked. No tunic, no trousers, no shoes. For an Iron Age man in Denmark, that is not how you went out into the world in everyday life. What does that mean? It could suggest ritual. In many cultures, stripping a person of their clothing before execution or sacrifice marks a transition from social identity to some other state. Criminal, victim, offering. It could also simply reflect practicality. Clothing was valuable. If someone was being killed, his garments might be removed to be reused. The presence of a belt but absence of other garments complicates this. Was the belt symbolic? Was it overlooked when other clothing was taken? Was he wearing only a simple wrap or garment that decayed differently and is no longer recognizable? Status is equally ambiguous. The cap is well made but not insanely luxurious. There are no obvious jewellery items, no weapons, no tools. That might argue against high elite status. On the other hand, the care taken with his noose, the apparent attention to his body's placement, and the fact that his death involved a method often associated with formal punishment or ritual suggests that he was not just some anonymous nobody. People spent time and effort on him. That implies significance of some kind, even if we can't specify what. All of this, the face that looks asleep, the rope that speaks of violence, the naked body with only a cap and belt, tempts us to start telling a story. It's easy to imagine his last walk to the bog, the hands that bound the noose, the people who watched. It's even easier to imagine his life before that, the fields, the feasts, the arguments, the beliefs, Our brains are wired for narrative. When we see a human face, especially one as well preserved as Tolland Man's, we instinctively start filling in the blanks. But there is a line between humanizing and inventing. We can say with some confidence that he was a middle-aged man in reasonably good health, that his hair and beard were recently trimmed, that he was hanged or strangled with a carefully made leather noose, that he was placed in the bog with at least some attention to position, that he wore a cap and belt but no other preserved clothing. We can say that many of the apparent bodily distortions are the work of the bog, not of his killers. Beyond that, we move into possibilities, not facts. He may have been a criminal. He may have been a sacrifice to gods associated with the bog. He may have been an executed enemy, a social outcast, or even a respected member of the community given to the wetlands in a desperate appeal for favour. Each interpretation carries its own emotional weight, its own sense of who he was and why he died. If we want to treat him with respect, we have to hold both things at once: the emotional pull of his very human face and the discipline of not claiming to know what we do not. We can let ourselves feel something when we look at him: sorrow, curiosity, unease, without turning him into a character in a story we've written in our own image. The next step is to step back from the man as he lies before us and ask a more technical question. If he died about 2,400 years ago, how do we know? And what can the science of dating actually tell us about when, exactly, he took his last breath? When you hear 2,400 years ago, it sounds precise, almost like a timestamp, as if someone checked a calendar, circled a day in red ink and wrote, "This is when Tolland Man died." That is not how this works. What scientists really have is a range, and that range comes from a technique that sounds simple in principle and turns out to be maddeningly complex in practice: radiocarbon dating. The basic idea starts in the sky. High-energy particles from space slam into atoms in the upper atmosphere and create a radioactive form of carbon called carbon-14. This carbon-14 mixes with ordinary carbon, gets absorbed by plants through photosynthesis, and then moves up the food chain into animals and into us. As long as something is alive, it is constantly exchanging carbon with the environment, keeping its internal carbon-14 level roughly in balance with the atmosphere. The moment it dies, that exchange stops. From that point on, the carbon-14 inside its tissue starts to decay at a predictable rate. It doesn't disappear all at once, it fades. After about 5,730 years, half of the original carbon-14 atoms are gone. That duration is called a half-life. After another 5,730 years, half of what remained is gone, and so on. If you can measure how much carbon-14 is left in a piece of once-living material, you can estimate how long it has been since it stopped being alive. In Tolland Man's case, that piece of once-living material is built in. His body, his hair, the leather of his noose, even the plant fibres in the surrounding peat, all contain carbon. Each one is a tiny clock that started ticking when it died. Radiocarbon labs take microscopic samples from these materials and measure the ratio of carbon-14 to stable carbon. From that ratio, they calculate a radiocarbon age, a number like 2,350 radiocarbon years before present. Present in this system is defined as the year 1950, when the method was standardized. Already you can see the problem. That number is not the same as calendar years before now. The curve between the amount of carbon-14 and actual calendar time is not a straight line. There's a reason for that, and it lives back in the sky again. The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has not been constant. Solar activity, Earth's magnetic field, volcanic eruptions, even human activities in more recent centuries all nudge the production and distribution of carbon-14 up and down over time. That means that two objects with the same carbon-14 content could, in theory, be from slightly different calendar years, depending on what the atmosphere was doing when they were alive. To sort this out, scientists built what they call calibration curves. They took things we can date independently, tree rings from very old trees for example, and measured the carbon-14 inside each ring. Tree rings give you an exact year of growth. By linking each ring's known age to its carbon-14 level, you build a chart that shows, for a long stretch of the past, how radiocarbon years line up with calendar years. Do this with thousands of rings from many trees, plus corals, lake sediments, and other well-dated archives, and you get a detailed wiggly line, the calibration curve. That curve lets you take a raw radiocarbon measurement and translate it into a calendar age range with statistical uncertainties included. So when you hear that Tolland man died about 2,400 years ago, what the data really say is something more like, based on the remaining carbon-14 in this sample, and after calibration, there is a high probability he died somewhere within this particular span of calendar years. Not a single year, a band. For Tolland man, multiple radiocarbon measurements have placed him broadly in the 4th to 3rd centuries BCE. Different samples and different rounds of testing cluster around similar intervals. When people compress that into 2,400 years ago, they're averaging a range that covers several decades, maybe even a century or more, depending on which calibration dataset you use and what level of probability you accept. And this is not carved in stone. Calibration curves are refined over time, as laboratories gather more high-quality data, more tree rings from different regions, more precisely dated corals, better control over measurement errors. The curve becomes sharper. Sometimes, for a particular interval, the curve flattens or even wiggles back on itself. That means that one radiocarbon value might match more than one possible calendar window, creating plateaus where precision drops. When the curve is updated, old radiocarbon dates can be recalibrated. A death once thought to have occurred, say, between 400 and 300 BCE, with one curve might shift slightly closer to 350 to 250 BCE with new data. The body in the bog doesn't move. Our model of time does. Radiocarbon dating also has another vulnerability: contamination. If you're trying to read the clock inside a tiny sample of ancient skin, the last thing you want is modern carbon sneaking in and resetting the hands. A stray fingerprint, a smear of conservation glue from the museum, traces of peat that seeped in after burial. All of these can introduce newer carbon and make the sample look younger than it really is. Older carbon, from things like groundwater carrying dissolved limestone, can pull the apparent age in the opposite direction. This is why the chain of custody for a sample matters so much. From the moment a piece of Tolland man's tissue or peat is selected, it is tracked. Who took it? When? How it was handled? What tools touched it? Where it was stored? In the lab, there are elaborate cleaning steps to strip away contaminants, acid and alkali baths, solvent washes, careful removal of surface layers, sometimes even isolating specific molecules like collagen from bone or keratin from hair, because those survive better and hold a cleaner signal. Every stage is documented, because if something goes wrong, if the date comes back wildly out of line with expectations, you need to be able to ask, was it the sample, the handling, the measurement, or our interpretation? And radiocarbon dates are never read in isolation. They are cross-checked against other kinds of evidence. Think about the rope around his neck, the style of braiding, the way the leather was prepared, the design of the noose. These can be compared with other ropes from well-dated archaeological contexts. The same goes for his leather cap, his belt, even microscopic traces of textiles or plant materials caught in the peat around him. Textile weaves change over time. Tool marks evolve as new technologies spread. Decorative styles appear, peak, and fade. Archaeologists build typologies, systematic catalogues of forms and styles that allow them to say things like, this kind of cap construction is typical of the later pre-Roman Iron Age, or this leather working technique doesn't appear before a certain century. None of this is perfectly sharp, but it gives another set of brackets. Probably not earlier than this, probably not later than that. The bog itself provides more clues. Peat doesn't accumulate randomly. Layer by layer, year after year, plants grow, die, and are compressed. Pollen grains from surrounding vegetation get trapped in those layers. By taking cores through the bog and analysing the pollen at different depths, scientists can reconstruct environmental history. Which trees dominated the landscape? When fields were opened up for agriculture? When certain crops appeared? If Tolland man is lying in a particular layer, and that layer sits between others with known environmental signatures tied to regional chronologies, his burial can be slotted into that broader sequence. In some cases, you can even see shifts associated with human land use, more cereal pollen indicating more farming, for example, that match the period when Iron Age societies in Northern Europe were expanding agriculture and clearing forests. Put all of this together, radiocarbon ranges, artifact typologies, peat stratigraphy, pollen records, and you get something more robust than any single line of evidence on its own. Each strand has its uncertainties. Braided, they start to narrow down where in time this man belongs. For Tolland man, that place is in the Iron Age of Northern Europe, in the centuries before the Roman Empire reached this far north. It was a world of small farming communities, longhouses of timber and thatch, fields edged by wetlands and forest. Iron tools were increasingly common, but the full machinery of states and cities had not yet arrived in Denmark. This was the pre-Roman Iron Age, when local chieftains and ritual specialists held power, when warfare and alliances were matters between neighbouring groups rather than empires. To his contemporaries, he was not an ancient body or a 2,400-year-old man. He was simply one more living person in that landscape of fields, bogs, and sacred places. The science that lets us place his death in that world is remarkable, but it can only ever give ranges and probabilities, not exact dates. What it does give us, though, is a time frame solid enough to start asking a different kind of question. In that Iron Age world, in those particular centuries, what did a rope around the neck and a body in a bog mean? The rope is the loudest object in that bog. Before anyone sent samples to a radiocarbon lab, before pollen diagrams and calibration curves, there was a man with a noose around his neck. That image alone pushes the mind toward a story. Execution, murder, sacrifice. But if you slow down and listen carefully, the rope itself starts arguing for and against each of those possibilities. Start with what it's made of. Tolland man's noose isn't a random tangle. It's a carefully twisted cord of plant material and leather, made from strips that someone had to cut, split and work with their hands. Under a microscope you can see how the fibres have been laid together. The direction of the twist, the tightness of the plies, the evenness of the strands. These tiny details are like a fingerprint of technique. People don't invent rope from scratch every time they need it. Rope-making traditions are learned skills. In one region, people might favour a Z-twist, in another, an S-twist. Some communities braid 3 strands, others ply 2, some add a reinforcing cause. The way the Tolland rope is constructed places it firmly in that Iron Age technological world. It doesn't look like an amateur's first attempt. It looks like the work of someone who had done this many times before. That already tells us something important. Whatever happened to him, it did not begin with a panicked scramble for any old cord. This was rope drawn from a cultural toolkit that people knew well. The workmanship goes further. Look at the consistency. Are the strands even, or do they thicken and thin in irregular patches? Are there hasty splices where a broken strand was knotted and continued, or long, smooth runs that suggest careful preparation? Archaeologists and textile specialists study these things the way an art historian studies brushstrokes. In Tolland man's case, the rope shows deliberate, practiced manufacture. Someone cared enough, or needed enough, to make something reliable. Then there are the knots. Knots are like verbs in the language of rope. They tell you what the rope was supposed to do. A slip knot tightens under tension. A fixed loop stays the same size. A simple overhand knot is easy and crude. More complex knots suggest specialized knowledge. The noose around Tolland man's neck is not just a random tie. It is a loop, with the free end running around and back designed to cinch tight. That kind of arrangement is not typical for everyday binding, like tying up a bundle of wood. It belongs to a family of knots whose entire logic is constriction around a single point. The placement, high on the neck, under the chin, reinforces that impression. This wasn't meant to restrain his arms or feet. The focus was the throat. Even the wear patterns on the rope have something to say. If a rope has been used many times, you see polished fibres, areas where the strands have flattened, maybe fuzzing or small breaks where friction has weakened the structure. A rope used just once in a single violent event shows a different signature: sharp creases where it was pulled suddenly, compression marks where it bit into flesh, but not the long, uniform smoothing of long service. What survives on Tolland Man suggests that this was not just an old household rope repurposed at the last minute. It may have been made or selected for this occasion, used for a specific task, and then left in place as part of that task's completion. That leans us away from improvisation and towards something more planned. But planned what? This is where we bump into the big question. Was this rope meant to hang him, to strangle him, or simply to bind him? Hanging and strangulation both end in lack of oxygen, but the mechanics differ. Hanging uses body weight and gravity. The knot placement, the angle of the rope, the position of the head all matter. In a full drop hanging, the kind designed to break the neck, you'd expect certain spinal injuries. In a shorter drop, or a suspension without a significant fall, death comes more slowly, through pressure on the airway and blood vessels. Manual strangulation or ligature strangulation, tightening a rope around the neck without suspension, produce slightly different forensic signatures, patterns of bruising, damage to soft tissues, sometimes fractures of cartilage in the larynx. For a modern forensic pathologist, these differences are crucial. With a body that has been in a bog for 2,000 years, those signals are muted but not necessarily gone. The skin is tanned, the soft tissues altered, but the relative position of the rope to the vertebrae, the angle at which it sits, the compression marks in the flesh, all provide hints. In Tolland Man's case, the rope lies snugly around the neck with the knot carefully placed under the left ear. That placement is consistent with hanging, as it would allow the loop to tighten when weight was applied, but also consistent with controlled ligature strangulation. It doesn't scream out one clear scenario. Instead, it says, someone knew what they were doing. They knew how to put a rope on a neck in a way that would kill. What about binding? Could this have been a restraint with the lethal act coming from something else? A blow, a stab, drowning? In principle, yes. A rope around the neck could be a way to control a prisoner, a lead to drag someone through marshy ground. But if that were the case, we might expect different handling at the end. Removal of the rope after death, or signs that it had been reused. The fact that the noose remained around his neck when he was laid, or dropped, into the bog suggests that the rope was not just a tool, it was part of the final state in which he was meant to exist. There's another complication. Bogs move things. Once a body is in waterlogged peat, it does not lie in a perfect, undisturbed museum pose for millennia. Peat swells and shrinks as it wets and dries. Gases form and escape. The body can shift, sink deeper, tilt. A rope that began at one angle can slide slightly. The knot that was originally at the back of the neck can end up nearer the side. Fibres can relax as the material absorbs water, then contract as it dries and is later conserved. This matters when we try to reconstruct exactly how the noose was positioned at the moment of death. Some of what we see today is original, some of it is the product of 2,000 years of slow motion. The peat is not a static display case, it's an active medium that has both preserved and subtly rearranged its contents. Even so, not everything is up for revision. The basic fact that the rope is still there, intact enough to analyse at all, is itself a clue. Organic fibres are fragile. In most burial environments, a rope like this would rot away within decades. That it survived here, down to the twist direction in individual strands, tells us just how oxygen-poor and acidic the bog remained. The same chemistry that tanned Tolland Man's skin into leather and dissolved his bones protected the rope from fungi and bacteria that would normally eat it. The survival of the rope also tells us something about handling after discovery. Early peat cutters and curious locals were not always gentle with what they found. Bodies were sometimes prodded, dismembered, even reburied elsewhere. In Tolland Man's case, the noose was left in place when he was lifted from the bog and later conserved. That means modern investigators can study not just a detached artifact, but the rope in situ on the neck it once constricted. That spatial relationship amplifies its evidentiary power. So what does the rope tell us if we try to sum it up? It tells us this was not an accident. This was not someone who slipped, fell, and got entangled in a stray cord. It points toward an intentional, practiced act involving a known technology, performed by people who had done similar things before. It suggests a procedure, whether judicial, ritual, or both, rather than a chaotic struggle. Yet the rope stops just short of telling us why. For that, we have to turn from the mechanics of killing to the body that was killed, the injuries, or lack of them, the posture, the expression, the final signs written in skin and stomach and bone. Only then can we start to ask, what kind of death was this, in human terms, not just forensic ones? If the rope is the loudest object in that bog, the body is the quietest. At first glance, Tolland Man looks almost peaceful. Closed eyes, relaxed mouth, the faint suggestion of a frown line rather than a scream. People see that face and feel a strange intimacy, like looking at someone who might wake up. But forensic work is the opposite of that feeling. It isn't about empathy first. It's about reading that stillness as data. Start at the neck, where rope and flesh meet. In a modern autopsy, the pathologist would peel back layers: skin, subcutaneous tissue, muscles, cartilage, looking for bruises, tears, fractures. In a bog body, those layers aren't what they used to be. The skin has been tanned by the bog acids, turned into a kind of organic leather. The fat has shrunk and shifted. Delicate structures like the larynx can be dissolved entirely. So the question becomes, what's original injury and what's just 2,000 years of chemistry? On Tolland Man, there is a clear groove in the skin where the noose bit into his neck. That furrow is not a gentle indentation. It's a compressed, darker band marking where soft tissue was pressed and deprived of blood. That's consistent with a ligature applied with significant force while he was still alive. But the depth and uniformity of that groove complicate things. In a typical hanging, especially a suspension where the body's full weight is bearing down, the mark often rises toward the point where the rope is anchored. It can be more V-shaped, running up toward the ear or the back of the head. In strangulation without suspension, the mark tends to be more horizontal, circling the neck evenly. Tolland Man's ligature furrow is surprisingly even around the circumference. That has led some experts to argue that his death might have involved constriction more than a clean drop. Then there's what we don't see: dramatic damage to the spine. In a full drop, execution-style hanging, the sudden stop can fracture the upper cervical vertebrae, especially between the skull and the second vertebra. With Tolland Man, the bones were mostly dissolved by the bog, but careful radiography and the remaining bony elements haven't shown clear signs of that kind of catastrophic break. That leans forensic opinion toward a shorter suspension or a slow tightening of the noose rather than a snapped neck. But it's not an open and shut case. Bogs can selectively preserve or destroy. Cartilage that might show subtle breaks is gone. Fine hemorrhages in neck muscles, classic signs of strangulation, are nearly impossible to interpret when those muscles have been chemically altered. Some early examinations were done before modern imaging and documentation standards. Every conclusion has to carry an asterisk. So if the neck is telling us violent pressure, probably from the rope, it's not answering the exact mechanism with absolute clarity. What about the rest of the body? Are there backup clues? Forensically, you'd next look for signs of other violence: blunt force trauma, stabbing, cutting, restraint. A blow to the head can leave fractures, internal bleeding, or characteristic lacerations. A stab wound can be obvious, or almost invisible externally if it's small and heals slightly before death. In Tolland Man, there are no obvious gaping wounds, no shattered skull, no ribs protruding through skin. That absence itself is a kind of statement. But experts don't stop at no big holes. They go hunting for subtler markers, irregularities in the skin that could be old scars or cut marks, discolorations that could be bruises. They inspect the scalp for hidden injuries, the chest for depressed areas that might indicate a blow, the back and limbs for defensive wounds, cuts and bruises you get when you try to shield yourself. So far, Tolland Man has not yielded clear evidence of additional assault. No obvious knife work, no crushed facial bones, no broken nose, no split lips, nothing that screams, he was beaten first. That doesn't mean there was no struggle. It means that if there was one, it didn't leave clear, durable traces that survived the Bogs' chemical editing. Restraint is another question. Were his wrists or ankles bound? On many bog bodies, you see ligatures on the arms, or at least deep grooves on the skin where bindings once were but have rotted away. Tolland Man's hands and feet show no such distinct, preserved marks. His right hand is tucked under his left knee in a slightly curled position, but that can be a burial pose or the result of slow movement in the peat as the body settled. Modern forensic anthropologists pay a lot of attention to the joints. If someone is hanged, the arms and shoulders sometimes adopt characteristic positions. If a body is trussed tightly, you can see long-lasting changes in how joints rest, tendons pulling fingers into claw-like shapes. In Tolland Man, the limbs are flexed, but not in the extreme contortions you'd expect from an individual who had been hog-tied or violently twisted. His posture looks composed rather than chaotic. That posture is fed into the idea that he wasn't dumped like trash, but placed. Knees slightly drawn up, arms folded in a way that could have been arranged by calm hands. Yet again, though, the bog muddies the water. Over centuries, the weight of peat can press a body into new alignments. What looks like an intentional pose could be a long, slow slump. From the big picture, forensic specialists move down to questions of who this man was, physically. Even with some bones gone, you can still estimate age, height, and overall health. Tolland Man's remaining skeletal elements and soft tissues suggest a man in his 30s or early 40s, not a teenager, not an old man. The lines on his face, the wear on his remaining teeth, the state of his joints all converge on that middle adult range. Height is trickier. Bogs flatten and compress. Muscles shrink. Ligaments can contract. By comparing limb lengths, reconstructed bone dimensions, and typical proportions from better preserved skeletons of the same period, researchers estimate his living stature at around 160 to 170 centimetres, roughly average or slightly below average for an Iron Age male in that region. Not a giant, not a child. Ordinary in physical presence. His general health, as far as we can tell, was decent. No massive deformities. No signs of advanced chronic disease etched into bone. No dramatic arthritic lipping. No grossly healed fractures. No obvious infection-related pitting. The teeth show some wear, as you'd expect from a coarse prehistoric diet, but not the catastrophic decay seen in later agricultural populations dependent on refined starches. He was not a starving, broken beggar hauled out for execution at the edge of death. He looks like a relatively robust adult who could have been working, farming, participating in community life until very shortly before he entered the bog. That portrait matters because some interpretations imagine bog victims as criminals, witches, or outcasts, while others see them as carefully chosen sacrificial figures. A well-nourished adult male in his prime fits multiple stories: the condemned warrior, the valued offering, the scapegoat, the volunteer. Forensics can narrow possibilities, but culture writes the script, and then we run into the hard limits of what any body, no matter how well preserved, can tell us. Cause of death seems obvious. Rope around neck, ligature mark, no other massive injuries. The simplest explanation is that he died from asphyxiation due to that noose. But even this simple explanation is not bulletproof. Was he fully alive when the rope tightened, or semi-conscious from some prior event? Did he perhaps drown if his body was suspended over bog water and his face ended up submerged? Did he suffer a sudden cardiac event triggered by fear or shock or pain before the rope cut off all air? Modern forensic exams often use internal signs to distinguish between types of asphyxia. Patterns of tiny hemorrhages in the eyes, swelling of certain organs, distribution of blood. In a 2,000-year-old bog body, Those capillary-level clues are essentially gone or uninterpretable. Poison, for instance, is nearly invisible unless it leaves very distinctive damage to hard tissues, and even then, bog chemistry can mask it. A quick, sharp blow to the head that stunned him, but didn't fracture bone, would leave little that survives. A ritual drug, a strong alcohol, a plant toxin taken as part of a ceremony, could pass through him without leaving a trace we can detect. So we end up with a layered answer. The body says the neck was constricted with deliberate force. The rest of the body says there are no glaring signs of other injuries or brutal restraint. The age and health say this was a capable adult man, not obviously sick or disabled. Together, these clues strongly support the idea that the rope was the primary instrument of his death. But they stop short of telling us the scene. They don't say whether he stood on a stool with witnesses chanting around him, or was shoved off a cart in a lonely patch of bog. They don't reveal whether he believed this was justice, punishment, or a journey to the gods. They don't whisper whether the hands that tightened the rope belonged to enemies, officials, or friends. To get closer to those human meanings, investigators turn to the last things his body held inside it. Traces of his final meal, and with it hints of his final day on earth. If the rope tells us how he died, his stomach tells us when. Not the hour on a clock, but the rough shape of his last day. Because Tollen Man, unlike most ancient skeletons, still had things inside him when he went into the bog, and the bog kept them. In a normal burial, soft tissues vanish, the gut collapses, whatever food was left decays and disperses. You can sometimes infer diet from worn teeth, from isotopes in bone, from residue on pottery, but you almost never get a snapshot of what this person ate on the day they died. Bog bodies are different. The same acids that tan their skin can slow the breakdown of plant fragments, and even microscopic grains of pollen. When scientists opened Tollen Man's abdomen in the 1950s, and again with more refined methods later, they found a compact dark mass where his small intestine and colon had been. Under a microscope, that mass turned into a landscape. You see seeds, bits of grain, fragmented husks, tiny pieces of plant tissue. Mixed into this are pollen grains, minuscule distinctive spheres and spikes produced by flowering plants. Each type of plant makes pollen with its own shape, almost like a fingerprint. Together these remains become a kind of biological logbook written in his last meals. The first question, what was he eating? Analysis has shown that Tollen Man's gut was full of porridge, not the creamy rolled oats you might picture, but a coarse, gritty mash made from barley and flax, mixed with a whole array of wild seeds. There are traces of rye, probably wild or early cultivated forms. There are seeds from plants like knotweed and goosefoot, species that grow as weeds in disturbed soil and along field margins. Some of the seeds were only partly crushed, suggesting they were stirred into the porridge without being fully milled. This mixture tells us several things at once. Barley and flax don't come from untouched primeval forest. They come from fields, from people who ploughed and sowed and harvested. That puts Tollen Man firmly inside an agricultural community. He wasn't a hunter-gatherer wandering through the bog. He belonged to a landscape of farms, fences, and stored grain. The weeds in the porridge matter too. In one interpretation, they are a sign of careful thrift. You harvest your fields, and along with your barley you collect the plants that grew in and around your crops. Their seeds are edible, full of fats and micronutrients. In times of scarcity, you keep them. In some traditions, you intentionally include certain wild seeds because they add flavour or because that's how our grandparents made it. In another interpretation, the weeds whisper something harsher. This is poor people's food. Higher status individuals in Iron Age societies probably ate cleaner grain, more meat, richer dairy. A porridge bulked out with whatever seeds came off the threshing floor could suggest modest status. A community not wealthy enough, or not willing to waste anything. But we have to be careful here. One last meal cannot stand in for a whole life. Ritual meals are often atypical. You don't sacrifice an animal to the gods every day. You do it on special occasions. You don't always eat the same festival foods you eat before an execution or before an offering. That wild seed porridge might have been ordinary subsistence. It might have been special. Pollen gives us another layer, season. When you look at the pollen grains preserved in Tollen man's gut and the peat around him, certain plants jump out. There's evidence of cereal pollen, consistent with an agricultural setting. There are traces of species that bloom in late winter and early spring. Some researchers see this pattern and argue that he died in that narrow window, after winter, before full summer leaf, possibly around the time of sowing. That fits with something many cultures do, concentrate major rituals at turning points of the year. The end of winter, the beginning of the growing season, is exactly the kind of moment when people in a precarious agricultural world might offer something valuable to whatever powers they believed controlled the weather and the harvest. But pollen is tricky. A single gust of wind can carry grains from far-off trees. Bogs accumulate layers over time. Some of the pollen in his intestines could reflect what was floating in the air when he ate. Some could have come from the water used to cook his meal. Some might be background noise from the peat. So, while late winter/early spring is a reasonable inference, it's not a signed and dated calendar entry. Now look not just at what he ate, but how long before he died he ate it. Different parts of the gut empty at different speeds. In modern forensics, stomach contents can help estimate time of death to within a few hours, assuming you know how fast the victim's body processed food. In an Iron Age man preserved for over 2 millennia, you don't get that degree of precision, but you can still say something. Tollen man's stomach and small intestine still contain that porridge, in a fairly advanced state of digestion. The food had moved beyond his stomach, suggesting he had eaten several hours before death, often estimated around 12 to 24 hours beforehand, though those numbers carry big margins of error. His colon also held material, as you'd expect in someone who had been eating regularly, not someone in a state of prolonged starvation. That last detail matters. There is no clear sign that he had been fasting for days. His intestines weren't empty. There's no evidence for the kind of extended deprivation you might expect if someone were being slowly executed by hunger or held in brutal confinement. He appears to have eaten reasonably close to the time of his death. Could that last meal have been ritual? Possibly. Imagine a community that believes a human life is a profound offering, perhaps to ensure fertility of fields, success in war, or protection from disaster. They might have specific foods for that occasion. Perhaps a porridge that includes all the seeds of the land, symbolically representing the community's harvest. They might gather field-edge weeds deliberately, not out of poverty but out of meaning. To argue that with confidence, though, you'd want consistent patterns across many bog bodies, the same unusual ingredients, the same preparation style, the same timing relative to death. The evidence is mixed. Some other bog bodies do show special meals, meat-heavy feasts or foods not typical for their region. Others look mundane. Tollen man's porridge sits somewhere in between, rich in variety but not obviously extravagant. There's another ritual possibility people sometimes raise, purification by abstinence. In many cultures, fasting precedes contact with the sacred. If Tollen man had gone without food for a day or two and then eaten a single, specific dish shortly before his death, we might see that as a structured sequence. Cleanse, then consume, then die. The problem is that the gut evidence doesn't neatly map onto that narrative. His digestive tract doesn't look like that of someone who's been empty for long, then suddenly filled. It looks like someone whose body was still on its normal schedule. So, working with what we have, what might his last day have looked like? One plausible reconstruction goes like this. He wakes in a small Iron Age community, a scatter of houses on higher ground not far from the bog. It's cold, the kind of chill that clings even when the sun is up. The landscape around is a mosaic of heath, wet ground, and fields carved from the wild. Low barley, perhaps newly emerged, and last year's stubble. At some point in the morning he eats, maybe with others, maybe under watch. Coarse porridge thick with seeds. It's not a feast, but it's not nothing. Enough to keep a working man going. He swallows it, chews the tough bits, feels the warmth in his belly. Hours pass. Are they hours of waiting in confinement? Hours of ordinary tasks, pretending life is normal? Hours of preparation, washing, perhaps being marked or anointed? The body is silent on this. Bones don't tell us whether he spoke to family, whether he prayed, whether he struggled against what was coming. By the time his meal has moved from his stomach into his intestine, someone, or several someones, takes him toward the bog. If this was an execution, the walk might have been tense, controlled, accompanied by people with authority or weapons. If this was a sacrifice as some interpret it, the walk might have been ceremonial, with objects, words, perhaps music. In both cases, the destination is the same, the unstable, waterlogged edge of the peat. We know roughly where it ended. A patch of bog in what is now Jutland, wet enough to swallow a body whole and slowly, carefully, keep him. At some point near that edge, the noose was placed around his neck, tied in a knot that has survived as clearly as his face. Did they lift him onto a platform? Did he stand on a lowered branch? Was he eased forward or shoved? Did they watch until he stilled? Or did they turn away, trusting the rope and the bog to finish what they had started? We don't know. The last hours refused to assemble into a single definitive scene. Instead, we have a cluster of strong probabilities. He ate a seed-heavy porridge within a day of his death. That meal reflects a community rooted in agriculture, using both cultivated and wild resources. The pollen hints at a cool season, around the start of the farming year. His body shows no prolonged starvation, no obvious torture beyond the rope. Whatever happened to him, it happened to a man whose life, up until very near the end, seems to have followed the rhythms of a working Iron Age farmer. From there, the story leaves the realm of tissue and turns towards soil, landscape, and belief. To understand the world that produced that last meal and that last walk to the bog, we have to step back and look at the life unfolding around that wet, dangerous edge. To get any closer to his death, we have to understand his life. Not his biography, we don't have that, but the routine he was born into. The background hum of days and seasons around an Iron Age bog. Start with the land. This part of Jutland in the early Iron Age wasn't an untouched forest wilderness. It was a worked landscape, already centuries into farming. Imagine low, rolling ground, patches of woodland, open fields hacked out of the poor, sandy soil, and between them dark, waterlogged hollows where peat had been forming for thousands of years. On the slightly higher, drier ridges you'd have small farmsteads, not big stone villas, but clusters of longhouses built of timber, turf, and wattle, elongated buildings where people and animals shared the same roof. One end for the family, one end for the cattle, sheep, and goats, separated by a low wall or a change in floor level. The animals' body heat helping keep the humans from freezing in winter. A day in one of these households would have been full, repetitive, and physically demanding. Someone has to be up before dawn to tend the fire. In a world without matches, letting the hearth go out is a serious failure. Someone else checks the animals, milking cows or sheep, feeding pigs, making sure nothing has broken loose in the night. Children old enough to walk or old enough to carry water or fetch fuel. Older kids drive animals to pasture, scare birds off the fields, or help in whatever task is most urgent. The year, more than the clock, structured their time. Spring means ploughing and sowing. The plough is likely a simple ad, a wooden ploughshare that scratches grooves into the light soil. It's pulled by oxen, castrated bulls that double as traction engines and walking meat reserves. Men, women, and teenagers all join in, guiding animals, breaking clods, scattering seed from baskets, repairing fences the frost has pushed apart. Summer is weeding, watching, and guarding. Fence lines need constant upkeep. Livestock must be moved between grazing spots so they don't strip the land bare. Someone spends a lot of time walking the same paths, between field and bog, between house and water source. Autumn is harvest and slaughter. Barley and rye have to be cut, dried, threshed, stored. Grain goes into pits, bins, or coarse clay jars. Animals that can't be fed through the winter are killed and processed. Meat is salted, smoked, dried. Bones are split for marrow. Hides are scraped and tanned. Every part has a use. Waste is a luxury. Winter is maintenance and endurance. Tools are repaired. Textiles are spun and woven. Stories are told. If you need something made that takes time and patience, bone combs, fine belts, metal fittings. This is when it happens, by the light of tallow lamps and the glow of the central fire. The tools of this world were simple, but not crude. Iron had reached Scandinavia by Tolland man's time, though it was still expensive. A few key implements, knives, sickles, maybe the cutting edge of a plough, could be iron. Axes might have iron bits welded onto a softer core. Bronze still appeared in ornaments and heirloom objects, carefully maintained and repaired. Most daily work, though, relied on wood, bone, antler, and stone. Wooden rakes and forks for hay, antler tines shaped into harpoons or grain processing tools, stone querns for grinding. The rhythm of grinding grain by hand, pushing a heavy upper stone back and forth over a lower one, would have been a constant background noise, shoulders aching, fingers calloused, flour dust in the air. Inside the house, textiles were everywhere, even if the originals have mostly vanished. The North European climate is rough on cloth. In dry graves, wool and linen rot away, leaving only faint stains and rusted brooches. Bogs flip that script. The same waterlogged acidic conditions that preserve skin and hair can also preserve scraps of clothing, threads, even entire garments. From bogs and wet deposits, archaeologists have recovered fragments of Iron Age cloaks, skirts, belts, and caps. Many are woven from wool, carefully spun and densely beaten on upright looms. Stripes and patterns show that people cared about appearance. This wasn't just crude burlap. Tolland man himself wore a woolen cap and a belt, both preserved with remarkable clarity. The weave is even, the yarns well twisted. This tells us there were people in his community who knew how to shear sheep, clean and card wool, spin thread on drop spindles, and weave on looms tall as a person. That's not a hobby. It's an organised craft, mostly done by women and girls if we extrapolate from later sources. Linen, made from flax, likely provided underclothes and finer garments, but it survives less often. We infer its presence from tools, spindle whorls of different weights, loom weights, and the cultivation of flax itself, which shows up in the same pollen and seed records that told us about his porridge. Clothing in this world is protection and identity at once. A thick wool cloak can be the difference between life and hypothermia on a windy, wet day near the bog, but colour, pattern and fastening devices, belt hooks, brooches, pins, also signal who you are. Are you tied to a particular household? A kin group? Do you wear imported glass beads or simple bone pendants? Those choices, limited as they were, helped mark status and affiliation. Status existed here, even in small communities. The basic social unit was probably an extended family or kin group, several related households recognizing a senior figure, often an older man but sometimes a matriarch, as the head. Above that there were larger affiliations, lineages tracing back to a named ancestor, local chiefs or big men who could call people to war, organize feasts and mediate disputes. How do we know? Not from written records. Those come centuries later. Instead, we look at burial mounds, hoards of weapons or jewellery, and the distribution of fancy versus plain objects. Some Iron Age graves contain weapons, imported goods, ornate belt fittings, and sacrificed animals. Others are much simpler. That pattern suggests that wealth and power were already unevenly distributed. Someone in Tolland man's world was owed labour, allegiance, or at least respect by others. Obligation would have run through daily life like an invisible thread. You owed your kin help in the fields. You owed hospitality to relatives or allies who came through. You owed participation in communal building, in defence, and, crucially, in ritual. If Tolland man died as part of a collective act, it likely wasn't a private quarrel settled in secret. It would have involved some level of social sanction, approval or at least acquiescence from those who held authority. This community wasn't isolated either. By 400 to 300 BCE, Europe was laced with trade and contact networks. The so-called Celtic world to the south and west was flourishing. Hill forts, long-distance trade, distinctive art styles. Some of that filtered up into Jutland. We find Roman and continental imports in later periods, glass beads, bronze vessels, exotic ornaments. But even before Rome loomed large, goods and ideas were moving. Metalworking techniques, ornament styles, maybe even religious concepts travelled along routes that wound from southern Scandinavia down through Germany and beyond. Travel itself was mostly on foot or by simple vehicles. Carts with solid wooden wheels could creak along the better paths. Rivers and coasts were highways. Boats could move people and goods much more efficiently than any land road. For someone living near Tolland Bog, a journey of a few days could bring them into contact with different dialects, different dress, and perhaps different gods. And then there was the bog. To a modern eye, it's just a difficult wetland. To Iron Age farmers, it was many things at once: a resource, a boundary, and a place of danger and meaning. Peat was fuel. Dig it out, dry it, and you had blocks that could be burned when wood was scarce. That meant trips out to cut and stack peat, regular contact with the bog margins. Bogs also yielded useful things by accident. Preserved logs, fallen trees turned to bog oak, sometimes old metalwork or amber washed out of the peat. At the same time, bogs marked edges. They formed natural borders between territories. You graze your animals up to this wet line, and no further. Pathways might skirt the edges, narrow strips of firmer ground people learned to navigate in all seasons. Crossing the bog was risky. Stray a few steps from the known path and you could sink into saturated peat, invisible pools or treacherous mud. In many later northern traditions, liminal places, thresholds between firm and unstable ground, between cultivated field and wild, are charged with supernatural weight. It's reasonable to suspect something similar here. The bog wasn't just where you cut fuel, it was where things disappeared. Weapons, jewellery, tools, and even whole wagons have been found deliberately placed in bogs from this period and the centuries around it. Spears and swords thrust into the water, cauldrons set down and left. In some sites, dozens or hundreds of items, often bent or broken, as if symbolically killed, before being given up. These are not losses or accidents. They look like offerings. In that sense, the bog sat at the intersection of work, boundary, and belief. It was a place you went because you needed to, and a place you approached with caution and ritual. You might speak words before cutting peat. You might mark a crossing place with posts or stones. You might throw in a token when you needed something big from the world beyond human control. If a community came to see the bog as a doorway, a place where things pass from the living world to somewhere else, then depositing a human body there, bound and carefully placed, takes on a grim logic. The same landscape that gave them fuel, marked their limits, and swallowed their offerings also received some of their dead. Tolland Man's last walk to the bog happened against this backdrop of everyday labour and quiet fear. He came from a world of smoke-stained longhouses, of wool cloaks and barley fields, of kin obligations and distant rumours carried along trade routes. For his neighbours, the bog was not an anonymous dumping ground. It was a familiar, potent edge. To understand why a community might choose that edge for a death, whether as punishment, execution, sacrifice, or some blend of all three, we have to look more closely at how bogs themselves functioned in Iron Age mines. Not just as places to work, but as places to meet the sacred and the dangerous at the same time. Begin with a simple observation. People almost never pick random places for important acts. Births, marriages, burials, treaties. These tend to cluster in spots that already feel charged. Hilltops, river crossings, groves, crossroads. Places with a story attached. Bogs fall into that category, but in a particularly intense way. From the perspective of an Iron Age farmer, the world is divided into zones. The house and yard, controlled, warm, full of smoke and noise. The fields, risky, but understandable. You know what work needs doing. Beyond that, woodland and open rough ground. Useful, but less predictable. And then there's the bog. The bog doesn't behave like other land. You can walk across it one day and sink the next. A path that was safe last year might have shifted. Ground that looks solid can suddenly shake under your feet. Objects you drop don't just sit on the surface waiting to be picked up. They disappear, sometimes forever. Sometimes, unnervingly, they come back decades or centuries later, washed out by erosion or exposed by drought. In many cultures, places like that, unstable, hard to classify, become what anthropologists call liminal spaces, threshold zones, not fully one thing or another, a doorway between categories. For Iron Age communities, bogs sat exactly at that threshold, between land and water, between cultivation and wildness, between the human world and something beyond human control. We don't have their myths written down. No Iron Age priest left us a neat explanation that says, the bog is where you talk to the gods, but we do have their behaviour, frozen in the peat. When archaeologists map what comes out of northern European wetlands, patterns appear. You get deposits of weapons, spearheads, swords, shield bosses, lance tips, sometimes entire sets of gear. Many of these show little sign of everyday use. Some have been deliberately bent, blunted, or broken before they were placed in the waterlogged edge of a lake or bog. Whole shields have been neatly disassembled, parts scattered into the peat. You get jewellery and ornaments, neck rings, arm rings, belt fittings, brooches. Pieces that would have signalled status and identity when worn, suddenly taken off and abandoned where they cannot be recovered casually. You get tools and equipment, axes, cauldrons, woodworking tools, even wagons. Not trash, high-value objects. In some sites, dozens or hundreds of such items are concentrated in relatively small areas. You also get animals, horse bones, cattle skulls, whole skeletons of dogs or pigs, sometimes arranged in strange ways. Skulls lined up, limbs separated. In some cases they're clearly butchered. In others the cuts make no sense if the goal was simply meat. Put all this together, and it doesn't look like accidental loss, it looks like intention. Someone made the decision to take weapons that could have armed a warband, jewellery that marked rank, tools essential for farming or feasting, and animals that represented serious wealth, and send them into the bog, knowing they wouldn't come back. That is what offerings look like. We know from later written sources in northern Europe that people made gifts to gods and powers, weapons after victories, animals for good harvests, valuables to secure oaths. When we look back from those texts to the archaeological record of the centuries before, the continuity is hard to ignore. But there are important differences too. In some regions, lake beds and bogs are dominated by war gear. Think of the famous weapon deposits in Denmark. Entire sets of arms and armour, sometimes deliberately mutilated, thrown into lakes after what look like battles. In other regions, especially further north and west, the wetland offerings skew more toward tools, ornaments, and animals. The emphasis shifts from war to prosperity, from enemies defeated to relationships with land and livestock. Even within Denmark and northern Germany, not every bog tells the same story. One site might yield mostly weapons and male-associated gear, another mostly household items and female-associated ornaments. One could be used once for a dramatic concentrated deposit, another could receive small offerings sporadically over generations. The consistent element isn't the exact contents, it's the act of giving things up to a watery, unstable place and not taking them back. So where do bodies fit into this? At first glance, a corpse in a bog could be anything. A tragic accident, a murder victim hidden away, someone who wandered too far on a foggy morning. And those certainly must have happened. Bogs are dangerous in a mundane sense. People fall in. But not all bog bodies look like accidents. Some are naked or near naked, with no attempt at retrieval even when the death happened close to settlement. Some, like Tolland Man, show signs of careful placement. Gently arranged limbs, a composed facial expression, a rope knotted in a specific way. Others are pinned down with branches or poles. Some are accompanied by objects placed in ways that resemble offerings rather than everyday loss. In those cases, archaeologists and historians ask a different question. Why put a body here, in this particular way, instead of in a more ordinary burial place? In the same landscape and time period, we find graves on dry land, cremations in urns, inhumations under small mounds, burials with grave goods. Communities clearly knew how to bury their dead in ways that fit local custom. Choosing the bog is a deviation from that norm. One interpretation is punishment, that the bog is where you send people who don't deserve a proper burial. Outcasts, criminals, traitors, you deny them a place in the ancestral ground and let the bog swallow them instead. Another interpretation leans into the sacred side, that the bog is a stage for sacrifice, a place where especially significant offerings are made, not just things, but lives. These two possibilities aren't mutually exclusive. In many societies, the same place can be both a dumping ground and a holy site, depending on the context. The same body can be both criminal and suitable for sacrifice, depending on who tells the story. What the bogs give us is evidence of variety, and also of pattern. Across northern Europe, from Ireland and Britain through Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and into parts of Poland and Scandinavia, bog bodies appear in roughly the same broad time window, the later Bronze Age through the Iron Age and into the early Roman period. They are not equally common everywhere, but they cluster in certain zones. Some show violent deaths, strangling throat cuts, skull blows. Some show multiple injuries, as if the manner of death had to be emphatic. Some are young, some older. There are men, women, and teenagers. That mix complicates any one-size-fits-all explanation. What seems fairly consistent is the idea that a bog deposition was special. Whether the motive leaned more toward punishment, sacrifice, or something in between, it wasn't routine. Modern imagination adds its own layers. Stories about drowned witches, cursed warriors, or eternal lovers in the bog circulate today. They make great headlines and tourist brochures, but when we strip those away and go back to what excavations actually show, the picture is both plainer and more intriguing. We see bodies placed in wetlands with signs of deliberate action. We see them in landscapes where those same wetlands were already receiving weapons, ornaments, tools, and animals as offerings. We see regional differences in what exactly was given and how, but a shared habit of treating bogs as places where things are sent away, to the gods, to the spirits, to the other side of the threshold. We don't know the prayers spoken or the myths told. We don't know the names of the beings addressed. What we can see, preserved as clearly as Tolland man's stubble and cap, is the consistent human instinct to use treacherous, in-between places as conduits to the sacred. For the people who led him to that peat cutting edge, the bog was not just a wet hole in the ground. It was a participant, a receiver, maybe a judge. And that matters when we try to untangle what his death was meant to be. Were they executing a man the community had condemned, offering a life to powers they feared and depended on, or doing both at once, using the bog as the perfect setting where justice, terror, and devotion could all meet? To get closer to that question, we have to look directly at the human evidence on his body, the rope, the wounds, the pose. Because whatever their beliefs about the bog, the people who killed him left a forensic signature in his flesh. Stand in that peat-cutting trench for a moment, in your mind. The bog has given you a face, soft eyelids, a shadow of beard, lips closed as if simply sleeping. Around the neck a twisted rope, knotted with care. Under that calm expression, a broken life. Now comes the awkward part, deciding what kind of death this was. Archaeologists don't just ask, how did he die? They ask, in what story did this death make sense to the people who did it? For Tolland Man and others like him, three big storylines keep coming up. 1. He was executed, a punishment carried out by some form of authority. 2. He was sacrificed, a deliberately chosen offering to gods or powers, his death framed as a gift or an exchange. 3. He was simply a victim. Murder, feud, or private vengeance, later hidden in the bog because it was convenient and final. Each of these ideas fits some of the evidence and struggles with other parts. None of them is watertight, but together they sketch the range of possibilities. Start with execution. In later written sources from Northern Europe, communities absolutely have legal killings. Assemblies meet, laws are recited, judgments are pronounced. Thieves can be hanged. Traitors and oath breakers can be killed in public. Even earlier, during the Late Iron Age, Roman writers describe barbarian tribes who drown criminals in bogs or hang them in sacred groves. If we apply that frame backwards, Tollen man might have been someone the community condemned according to its own rules, not a random victim, but a man whose death was authorized. The rope helps that interpretation. It's not a scrap of opportunistic cordage. It's a carefully twisted multi-strand noose with a sliding knot, essentially specialized equipment for hanging. His neck shows the classic deep furrow of a tight ligature. His tongue doesn't protrude like a long, agonizing strangulation. The evidence points toward a relatively rapid death by hanging. Add to that the lack of obvious defensive wounds. His hands aren't broken or cut. His nails don't show signs of tearing at the rope. That could mean he was bound, or drugged, or simply overwhelmed and controlled. Either way, it doesn't look like a chaotic fight in a dark alley. It looks organized. Execution in many societies is not just killing, it is performance. You gather witnesses, you declare charges, you make the condemned visible to the group as a warning. This is what happens to people who cross certain lines. But when the body has hung, what then? In a world where burial customs are tightly tied to honor and belonging, what you do with the corpse can be as symbolic as the killing itself. Denying a person a place among the ancestors is a second punishment. If Tollen man was an executed criminal, the bog could have been exactly that, the opposite of a graveyard. Not the hill where your kin lie in urns under small mounds, but the wet threshold where the community's unwanted are sent away. No grave marker, no place for children to visit and pour ale. Just a slow descent into peat and forgetfulness. Except, of course, he wasn't forgotten. The bog kept him. The second storyline starts from a different place. It looks at the larger pattern of offerings in wetlands, bronze cauldrons, bent swords, animal carcasses, and asks whether some bog bodies belong with that category rather than with crime and punishment. Sacrifice. In that frame, Tollen man is not primarily a lawbreaker, he is an offering, perhaps selected for some quality, age, purity, social role, or perhaps chosen because he was already marked as marginal. His death would be meaningful above all as communication with powers beyond the human community. The evidence that supports this view comes from patterns that go beyond one body. When you line up the best preserved bog bodies across northern Europe, a few things jump out. They often die in liminal places, edges of bogs, transitional zones between dry land and deeper water. Many show a combination of injuries, strangling plus a cut throat, blows to the head and binding. Some have been pinned down with branches or stakes, as if to keep them in place. Others have had their bodies arranged with care. In archaeology, that combination of deliberate overkill and careful handling can signal ritual. There are also hints of timing. Pollen and stomach contents from some bog bodies suggest death in particular seasons, possibly linked to agricultural cycles or midwinter festivals. A last meal dominated by porridge grains and special seeds could be ordinary, or it could be part of a ceremonial fare. We can't be sure, but the clustering invites questions. In Tollen man's case, his last meal was a simple gruel of barley and flaxseed with weed seeds mixed in. It doesn't scream feast. It looks more like an everyday dish. But everyday food can still be ritual food, if it's eaten at the right moment with the right intention. If you imagine him as a sacrifice, you see the rope differently. It is no longer just a tool of justice. It is a ritual instrument. The bog is not a dumping ground. It is a mouth that receives offerings. The absence of grave goods is not disrespect, but part of the logic. He himself is the gift. The problem is that sacrifice can become a lazy label. For a long time, any unusual burial could get waved away as ritual, when archaeologists didn't understand it. A skeleton in a weird pose, ritual, a body with multiple injuries, sacrifice. That mindset explains everything and nothing. So scholars are cautious. To argue for sacrifice, they look for repetition and pattern. Similar methods of killing across multiple individuals, persistent use of one kind of place, associations with objects we already read as votive offerings. In some bogs, those patterns are fairly strong. In others, like the one that held Tollen man, the picture is more mixed. That brings us to the third storyline, murder or feud. Not every violent death in the past needs a grand frame. People in the Iron Age had tempers, grudges, ambitions. They fell in love, stole property, made enemies. Personal violence happened then as it does now. If Tolland man had been killed in a quarrel or as part of a family vendetta, the bog is a practically useful place to hide a body. It's close enough to reach, treacherous enough that retrieval is unlikely, and in a world without police or forensic science, it's as good as erasing the evidence. Some bog bodies look very much like that kind of scene. Carelessly dumped, twisted postures, no signs of the careful arrangement we see with Tolland man. A few show clear signs of restraint and torture that feel more like private cruelty than communal justice or solemn offering. If you emphasize the clandestine side, Tolland man's near nakedness could fit. Clothing removed to avoid identification, valuables taken. The rope could be whatever was at hand. The calm expression might simply be the result of rapid burial in oxygen-poor peat, not a sign of serenity in death. So how do scholars sort through these competing scripts? They weigh context, piece by piece. Location. Is the body alone or in a cluster? Close to known ritual deposits or in a random corner of the bog? Tolland man lay alone, but in a region already rich in evidence for wetland offerings. Bindings and position. Are there signs of deliberate restraint? Are limbs neatly arranged or flung? His body was curled, arms folded, almost like a sleeper. There's no clear evidence of tied wrists or ankles, but the posture doesn't look like an uncontrolled collapse. Injuries. Is there a single efficient killing blow, or multiple different forms of violence? His primary injury is the hanging itself. There are no apparent stab wounds, no skull fractures, no throat slashing. That leans more toward orderly execution than frenzied attack or multidimensional triple death sacrifice. Deposition method. Was he pushed in, dropped from height, pinned down, covered over? Tolland man appears to have been lowered or placed gently. The rope was still around his neck when he was found, but his body had settled into the peat as if in a shallow hollow. Then there is the comparative picture. How does he match or diverge from other bog bodies and from ordinary burials on dry land in his region and period? Dryland graves of the same era show cremations and inhumations with grave goods, family groupings and markers. Tolland man has none of that. He isn't treated like ordinary kin, yet neither is he hacked apart, mutilated or tossed like trash. That in-between quality is why debates over his status haven't settled. To some researchers, the organised, almost gentle handling combined with a choice of a liminal, already sacralised place tips the scales towards sacrifice. To others, the legal parallels in later Germanic law codes, hanging for certain crimes, denial of burial to serious offenders, make execution with a religious overlay the most plausible scenario. A few still argue for an interpersonal killing later framed or remembered in more cosmic terms. It's entirely possible the people who killed him wouldn't have separated those categories the way we do. Punishment, offering, and personal hostility can bleed into each other. A condemned man can be both criminal and fit sacrifice. A killing done for revenge can be cleansed or justified by sending the body into a sacred bog. A community can wrap its violence in the language of pleasing the gods. What the peat preserves is the end result of that decision. A man, a rope, a boundary place that both receives and erases. The motive sits behind it, in the minds of people whose words didn't fossilize. To chase that motive any further, we have to step back from this one face and look at the wider cast. The other men and women pulled from peat across northern Europe. The similarities and differences that might reveal what kind of deaths most often ended up in the bog. Once you zoom out from Tolland man, the landscape starts filling with other faces. Across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, Britain, there is a scattered constellation of people pulled from peat. Some are just bones, some are partial torsos or limbs, and a very few are so well preserved that you can almost meet their gaze. If Tolland man is the quiet, almost peaceful end of the spectrum, others are anything but. Take Grauballer man, found not far from Tolland's village, and dating from roughly the same Iron Age world. His body tells a different story at first glance. His throat was cut from ear to ear, the wound so deep it almost severed his head. His skull and leg show signs of blunt force trauma, heavy blows delivered before or around the time of death. His fingers are intact, but his features are twisted, his mouth dragged wide. If Tollin looks like he's sleeping, Grauballa looks like he died in motion. Yet when you look past the violence, familiar details reappear. He too was naked when he went into the bog. He too was placed carefully in a shallow pool, rather than thrown into deep water. He too lay alone, not in a mass grave or jumbled pile. His hair and beard were trimmed, not wild and unkempt. Someone had taken time with him. Move west to Ireland, and you meet another set of men whose bodies refuse to fit into one simple category. Old Crogan man and Clonnicavan man, both discovered in Irish bogs, are often discussed as a pair. They're a few centuries younger than Tolland, but the cultural logic might be related. Old Crogan man was huge by the standards of his day, over 6 feet tall in life. Only his torso survives, but even that is densely layered with clues. His upper arms were threaded with plaited leather thongs like armbands or bindings. Deep cuts mark his nipples, a detail some scholars link to later Irish legends, where touching the king's nipples is a gesture of submission or sovereignty. He was stabbed, his chest pierced, his body dismembered. Stakes and woven withies pinned him into the peat. Clonnicavan man, on the other hand, was shorter, slighter, but his hair stopped everyone. It had been carefully piled and shaped into a high-fronted style using a resinous gel, imported according to chemical analysis, from as far away as southwest France or Spain. His skull was shattered by at least one heavy blow, his nose and teeth were broken, his torso shows damage that may come from dismemberment. Like old Croggan, he ended up in a bog, carefully placed, not simply tossed. Different countries, different specific injuries, and yet the same chorus of themes keeps repeating. Cords, thongs, ropes looped around necks or arms, or binding hands and feet, clothing removed or reduced to small fragments, hair deliberately cut, shaved, or styled. Tolland with his short-cropped beard, Clonnicavan with his elaborate pompadour, some German bog bodies with half-shaved scalps or distinctive bangs. Wounds that go beyond what's needed to kill. Cut throats plus head blows, stabs plus strangling, dismemberment after death. Bodies pinned, weighed down with branches or anchored by stakes, as if people were anxious that they not float away, or perhaps not walk away. And on top of all that, the careful placement. Again and again, when bog bodies are found in situ, they're not in random positions. Arms folded, legs tucked, heads laid on slight rises or turned toward particular directions. Sometimes they lie at the very edge of wet and dry ground, right on the threshold. Sometimes they rest near older trackways, causeways, or known ritual deposits of weapons, cauldrons, and animal bones. For archaeologists, that mix, the brutality of the injuries, the restraint implied by cords, the attention shown in grooming, and the composed final pose, screams intention. These were not drunken brawls frozen in time. Somebody made choices. But for every classic bog body that seems to fit these patterns, there are others that complicate the neat storylines. Some finds are just parts of people, a leg with preserved skin and hair, a head with no attached torso, a hand emerging from the peat. With these, the context is fragmentary in every sense. Were they whole bodies once, later cut by peat digging and machinery? Or were only parts deposited to begin with? There are also cases where the injuries are ambiguous. On some individuals, marks once interpreted as torture or deliberate mutilation now look, under closer forensic analysis, more like natural damage from the weight of peat, the movement of water, or later spade cuts from peat cutters. Broken bones could come from violence, or from the slow crush of a growing bog. Skin slippage and tearing can mimic knife wounds. Even determining whether a rope is a killing instrument or a post-mortem binding isn't always straightforward. A cord around an ankle might have been used to drag a body, to lower it into a pool, or to secure it against the shifting surface. A noose around a neck might be execution, might be strangulation, or might be an attempt to keep the head attached to the body if the bog was known to disturb corpses. Then there are the possible accidents. Not every body in a bog died by another's hand. Peat bogs are treacherous. Mist, uneven ground, concealed pools, floating sphagnum that looks solid until you step on it. Historical records from later centuries are full of people, animals and carts lost in wetlands by mistake. A few bog skeletons look exactly like the result of such mishaps. No obvious trauma beyond what you'd expect from a fall, clothing still on, no cords, no signs of restraint or special treatment. Children in particular may have wandered off and drowned. These remains blur the line when we look at the wider sample. If you only counted the visually dramatic cases, you'd skew your impression toward ritual and violence. If you include every stray bone from a bog, you risk drowning the signal in noise. Some bodies carry mixed signals. Maybe they were found near clear ritual deposits, a cluster of weapons, a cauldron, animal bones. But their own injuries suggest a clean, efficient execution, nothing more. Maybe they have ritual-seeming details, shaved patches of hair, nipple cuts, bindings, but lie in what appears to be a marginal, unremarkable corner of a peatland. Or they date from time periods where we have almost no other evidence of elaborate wetland cult, making it hard to anchor them in a broader religious setting. Every time scholars think they see a tidy rule, bog bodies are ritual sacrifices, bog bodies are executed criminals, bog bodies are outsiders denied normal burial. Some awkward individual crawls out of the peat and says, "Not so fast." So what do the patterns suggest if we tread carefully? They point above all to bogs as places where certain kinds of extraordinary deaths ended up. Whatever the specific labels, sacrifice, punishment, feud, accident, these were not ordinary burials. When Iron Age communities wanted to treat a death as normal, they had cemeteries, urnfields, flat graves, barrows. They placed people with grave goods, with kin, under markers. The bog is where they did something else. Repeated use of cords and ligatures hints at a cultural familiarity with strangling and hanging as acceptable ways of killing. That aligns with later legal traditions in Northern Europe, where hanging is a standard penalty for particular crimes, and where certain condemned are excluded from burial among their kin. The careful grooming and hair treatments, the deliberate shaving or styling, suggest that people's appearance at the moment of death mattered. It may have reflected status, chosen role, or ritual preparation. Decorating or transforming the body could have been part of marking someone as set apart, either elevated as an offering or representative, or degraded as someone stripped of ordinary identity. The combination of multiple wounds on some individuals, the so-called overkill, combined with pinning or weighting in bog pools, hints at a worldview in which sending someone into the wetland had to be done thoroughly. Maybe this was about preventing restless dead from returning. Maybe it was about making sure the gods, spirits or powers of the bog really received what was sent. Maybe it was about demonstrating, very visibly to the living, that certain boundaries had been crossed and that the response would be total. At the same time, the presence of accidents and more prosaic violent deaths in bog contexts reminds us not to mythologize every corpse. A place that is both dangerous and sacred will collect both ordinary and extraordinary endings. Some people probably did just fall in. And then there is the most disruptive pattern of all. Every new body has the power to overturn the framework built from the last ones. When Tollan Man was first studied in the 1950s, he helped cement the idea of the bog sacrifice, the serene victim, the ritual rope, the holy marsh. Later, finds like Old Krogan and Clonny Caven, with their apparent links to kingship symbolism and imported beauty products, push some scholars toward images of failed rulers, elites turned into offerings. Improved dating has shown that what once looked like a wave of sacrifices at one moment in time actually spans centuries. Re-examination of old photographs and field notes has downgraded some triple deaths from ritual martyrdoms to more mundane combinations of wound and bog damage. With better CT scanning, isotope analysis, and microscopic study of hair, skin and contents of wounds, interpretations keep shifting. A cut once thought lethal turns out to be post-mortem. a supposed binding mark is revealed as a fold from compression. A hairstyle reveals trade connections that force us to rethink who these people were in life. In that sense, Tolland man is not a solved puzzle, but one node in a moving pattern. He shares the rope, the liminal location, the nakedness, the careful placement with many other bog bodies. He lacks the multiple violent injuries and dramatic mutilations of some Irish and Danish counterparts. He sits somewhere between the clearly accidental bog dead and the theatrically overkilled ritual victims. As more faces emerge from the peat, the picture of Iron Age life and death around bogs becomes both richer and stranger. Instead of narrowing toward a single explanation, the evidence keeps widening the spectrum of possibilities, suggesting that communities use these wetlands as flexible tools for dealing with people who, for one reason or another, could not be allowed a normal place among the ancestors, and that is where modern science has to tread very carefully. Because as our techniques for reading these bodies improve, the temptation grows to read more into them, to reconstruct individual biographies, motives, courtroom speeches, whispered prayers. The peat will give us skin pores and stomach seeds and knot patterns in rope. Whether it can ever give us the ethics of what was done and how we should respond to it now is another question entirely. Modern science begins in many ways with restraint. For a long time, the only way to learn from a body like Tolland man was to cut into him. Autopsy, dissection, sampling, knowledge purchased at the cost of the very thing you were trying to preserve. Now, the tools look different. Start with CT scanning. You can slide a body that has lain in a bog for 2,000 years into a machine designed for living patients, and, layer by layer, peel him apart without leaving a mark. The rope, the neck vertebrae, the cartilage of the larynx, the sinuses in the skull, the unerupted teeth in the jaw, everything becomes a stack of grayscale slices. From those slices you can build a three-dimensional model. Archaeologists and forensic specialists can rotate his head, zoom in on the cervical vertebrae, trace the path of a ligature, measure the angle of a broken bone. They can simulate the tightening of the noose, estimate the force needed to close off his airway, distinguish between a fracture caused by hanging and a crack caused by the slow crush of peat. And all the while, the actual neck, the actual bones remain untouched. Microscopes join in next. Fine sections of hair, already loose, not plucked, can be examined for growth patterns, chemical traces, stress markers. Skin surfaces can be scanned for tiny abrasions and pores, for insect bites, for the signature roughness of peat crystals versus the clean line of a blade. Non-invasive doesn't mean non-intrusive in a moral sense, but technologically it is a revolution. It means you don't have to choose between the body as an object of study and the body as an object to be preserved. Then there's DNA, the glittering promise at the core of so many ancient skeleton studies. With bones from a cold, dry cave, you can sometimes conjure entire genomes out of powder. You can assign ancestry profiles, track migrations, compare ancient people to modern populations, find traces of diseases written into their chromosomes. With bog bodies, that promise runs into acid. Peat is wet, yes, but it's also chemically aggressive. Its acidity breaks down bone mineral. Its tannins bind to proteins in skin and connective tissue, tanning them in the literal sense, which is great for outer preservation and terrible for the fragile spiral molecules hiding inside cells. DNA strands get chopped into fragments, then into fragments of fragments, until what's left is more like confetti than a scroll you can read. There have been attempts. Tiny samples taken from deep inside bones or teeth, where conditions are a little more sheltered, sometimes yield short stretches of genetic code. Enough maybe to say this person was biologically male, or to place them on a very broad branch of the European genetic tree. In rare cases, enough to suggest they weren't closely related to other people buried nearby. But a neat, complete genome? In peatlands, that's still more hope than expectation. So modern science leans harder on other chemical messages, the ones that don't dissolve as easily. Isotope analysis is one of the quiet workhorses here. It sounds abstract, but think of it as the body's travel diary. The water you drink and the food you eat carry particular ratios of different forms of elements. Slightly heavier or lighter versions of oxygen, strontium, carbon, nitrogen. Those ratios vary from region to region, from coastal to inland, from limestone hills to granite plains, from a barley-based diet to one rich in meat or fish. When you eat and drink, Those isotopic signatures get locked into your teeth and bones, building up over time. Take a tiny sample from Tollund Man's tooth enamel, just once, because enamel forms in childhood and never changes again, and you get a snapshot of where he grew up. Compare that to samples from his bones or hair, which remodel over years or months, and you can see whether he stayed put or moved later in life. For some bog bodies, the result is very local. The isotopic profile matches the groundwater and soils within a relatively small radius of the find spot. These are people who probably lived and died in the same cultural landscape that placed them in the bog. For others, the chemistry looks off. Strontium ratios point to more distant geology. Oxygen suggests a different climate. Carbon and nitrogen hint at a childhood diet richer in marine protein, or in crops that weren't common in that particular region at that time. Those outliers raise tantalizing possibilities. Were they traders, hostages, outsiders captured in war, individuals moved as part of marriage alliances, people selected precisely because they came from elsewhere, and thus made powerful ritual offerings? Isotopes can't answer motives, but they can tell you that at least some of the people who ended up in northern European bogs were not born right next to them. The wetland was not just a local stage, it was part of a wider network of movement and contact. All of this, CT scans, microscopic hair analysis, isotopes, experimental DNA attempts, depends on one fragile condition. The body has to survive long enough to be studied, and that is where conservation becomes its own quiet drama. Inside the bog, Tollund Man was in a kind of chemical deep freeze. Dark, cold, oxygen-poor water cut off most of the microbes that would normally eat a corpse. Acids and tannins pickled his skin, shrank his soft tissues, stabilized him in a strange equilibrium. The moment he was pulled out of that environment, that equilibrium shattered. Dry air makes tanned skin crack. Oxygen wakes up dormant bacteria and fungi. Temperature changes make already fragile tissues expand and contract. If you simply left a bog body on a table, it could go from astonishingly preserved to collapsing ruin with alarming speed. So conservators have to stage a kind of rescue operation. They carefully control humidity and temperature. They soak some remains in special solutions to replace the water in the tissues with more stable substances. They support limbs and heads so that gravity doesn't slowly distort them. They battle mold, monitor pH levels, and sometimes accept that parts of a body, organs for instance, will never be stable enough to keep and must be documented, and then allowed to decay. Every decision is a trade-off. Every intervention that stabilizes the remains also changes them. Every day on display is a day of slow, almost invisible wear. And this brings us to the question that hangs, uneasily, over every glass case that holds a human being. What exactly are we doing when we put a man like Tollund in a museum? On one level, the rationale seems straightforward. These bodies are extraordinary historical documents. They show us how people lived and died, what they ate, what they believed about wetlands, punishment and sacrifice. Exhibiting them allows the public to see the past not as abstract dates, but as real human faces. That encounter can be moving, even transformative. On another level, it's less simple. Tollund Man did not consent to be preserved, studied, scanned, sampled, and stared at by millions of strangers. Neither did Grobale Man, Old Krogan Man, Clonikavan Man, or any of the others. Whatever their deaths were meant to do in an Iron Age worldview, to honour, to punish, to appease powers in the marsh, it almost certainly did not include an afterlife under museum lights. Modern ethics has to wrestle with that disconnect. Some argue that because the individuals come from societies with no direct continuous descendant communities that can speak for them, the responsibility falls to archaeologists, curators, and the broader public to act as careful stewards. That means minimizing destructive sampling, using non-invasive methods where possible, and framing displays in ways that emphasize personhood rather than spectacle. Others point out that display can easily slide into voyeurism. A bog body's uncanny preservation, wrinkled skin, closed eyes, the rope still around the neck, can turn him into a curiosity, a kind of horror attraction, especially in popular media. The line between education and objectification is thin. Museums respond in different ways. Some choose to show only casts or 3D reconstructions, keeping the actual remains in controlled storage. Some cover particularly sensitive parts of the body, or design exhibits that require a deliberate choice to enter, rather than confronting visitors unawares. Many now include clear interpretive panels that talk directly about respect, dignity, and the debates surrounding human remains. Behind the scenes, researchers face quieter versions of the same tension. Do you drill a tooth for isotopes, knowing it's a one-time, irreversible act to answer a specific question about mobility? Do you sacrifice a tiny fragment of bone in the hope, only the hope, of retrieving a sliver of ancient DNA? How many times should one body be sampled for different projects? Who decides when enough is enough? There is no single rule that fits every case. But a pattern is emerging. The more we learn technically, the more the ethical questions push to the forefront. We can now reconstruct a face, model a last meal, map childhood movements, and scan the interior of a skull without a scalpel. We can, in a sense, bring someone like Tollund Mann closer to us than his own contemporaries might ever have imagined. That power makes it harder, not easier, to ignore the fact that he is not just data. He is a dead person whose manner of dying was, in all likelihood, extreme. Modern science can tell us more and more about how his body came to be in that bog and what happened to it afterward. It can outline scenarios, sketch probabilities, and test some stories against the microscopic and chemical evidence. What it cannot do is tell us how he would feel about the way we treat him now. That silence is the space where ethics lives, between our hunger to know and our obligation to recognize, even in a 2,400-year-old man with a rope still around his neck, a fellow human being. And it's from within that tension that we have to ask, carefully, what we can responsibly conclude about his death, and what we should leave as questions that the peat, even under all our machines, may never fully answer. We can start with the one thing almost everyone agrees on. Tollund Mann did not just lie down in that bog and drift off to sleep. The noose around his neck is not decoration. It's a functional object, still looped, still knotted, still digging faintly into the tanned skin. The position of the ligature, the orientation of the knot, the angle of the cervical vertebrae, the signs of compression in soft tissues, all of that, when you line it up with what we know from modern forensic hangings, points toward deliberate killing by asphyxiation. Was it a classic hanging, with the body dropping and the neck breaking? The physical evidence leans away from that. There's less sign of the catastrophic fractures you see in long drop executions. What it looks more like is a short drop or suspension hanging. The rope tightens, the airway closes, the blood supply to the brain is cut off, and unconsciousness comes in minutes. So, responsibly, we can say this. He died with a rope constricting his neck. Someone tightened it. This was not an accident. Beyond that, the rope itself gives us a little more to work with, but only a little. It's carefully made, twisted from plant fibres, evenly plaited, finished with a loop that slides cleanly over the head. This isn't an improvised length of random cord grabbed in panic. It's a prepared object. The way it's tied matters too. The knot sits under the chin, or to the side, not at the back of the neck the way you might place it if you were trying to hoist someone high. That placement affects how the body would hang, where the pressure would fall on the throat, how visible the noose would be if the person were displayed. Taken together with the absence of other deep, violent trauma, no multiple stab wounds, no hacked limbs, no crushed skull, this suggests his death was meant to rely on the rope as the main instrument. There's no clear sign of a prolonged fight, no broken fingers, no massive defensive injuries. Whatever happened, it was controlled. So the rope most likely indicates an intentional killing in a highly structured context. Structured because the tool was prepared. Structured, because the body was placed with care. Structured because this wasn't just about making someone dead. It was about how they died and how they were left. But here's where the ground suddenly turns soft under our feet. An Iron Age rope around a neck could mean several overlapping things at once. Execution by law, lynching by a community, sacrifice to gods, ritual killing of someone already condemned, symbolic sending of a person into the bog as an offering, or some combination of these that doesn't map neatly onto any modern category. The same evidence that looks like ritual to one scholar can look like punishment to another. He was naked except for the noose and a cap and belt. That nudity could mark him as a criminal stripped of status, or as a ritual victim returning to the earth without possessions. His body was gently arranged, not dumped. Is that reverence for a sacred offering, or a final gesture of humanity toward a condemned man? He shows no obvious signs of long-term torture or mutilation. That might argue against the kind of exemplary, agonizing execution meant to terrorize a community. It might also fit a sacrificial logic in which the gift has to be physically intact. The truth is, the rope is clear about method and murky about motive. The bog's preservation plays with our sense of certainty in a similar way. Look at his face, the stubble on his chin, the faint furrow of the brow, the eyelashes still resting against closed lids. The detail is so intimate that it feels like you're reading emotion straight off his skin. Peaceful, people say, serene, as if we can see that he accepted his fate or died without pain. But facial expression in death is not a reliable diary of inner life. Muscles relax, skin shrinks and tightens in strange patterns. The process of tanning in the bog can soften lines or exaggerate them. Whatever Tolland man felt in his final seconds, fear, resignation, anger, religious ecstasy, didn't fossilize. What we see is a face curated by chemistry, not a photograph of a last thought. The bog preserves him so well that he feels transparent to us. He isn't. What we can use him for, with more confidence, is as a lens onto the wider world that produced him. His stomach contents place him in an agricultural community that knew how to grind grain, cook porridge, and combine multiple ingredients in a single dish. The absence of meat in his last meal suggests that on at least that day, meat was either scarce or deliberately avoided. Some have argued that the unusual seed mix looks ritual, a special concoction. Others point out that poor folks across history have eaten whatever grain and weed seeds they could scrape together. The state of his teeth and bones points to a life that involved hard work and periods of nutritional stress, but not the catastrophic malnutrition you see in repeated famines. He lived long enough to be an adult, old enough for lines to etch themselves into his face, but not so old that his joints were destroyed. This fits a society where survival to middle age was possible if you avoided disease and violence, but not guaranteed. The very decision to use the bog as a place for a body tells us something about Iron Age ideas of landscape. We know from other finds, weapon deposits, cauldrons full of offerings, more bodies, that wetlands in northern Europe were not just wasted land. They were liminal zones, neither dry nor fully water, neither cultivated nor wild in an ordinary way. A rope-bound man placed there is a data point in that pattern. Whoever killed him was using the bog's in-between status for a purpose. Fear, law, belief, and landscape are all braided together here. Fear, because a death like this would have reverberated through a community, whether as warning or as sacred drama. Law, because even in a world without written codes, societies develop rules about who can be killed, for what reasons, and by whose authority. Belief, because to put a body in a place where things don't rot in the usual way is to make a statement about what counts as an ending and what doesn't. Landscape, because this wasn't a random ditch. It was a specific wetland, part of a network of fields, paths, settlements, and sacred places that structured everyday life. What remains open are the questions that matter most to our storytelling instincts. Who exactly was he in his community? A criminal? A scapegoat? A volunteer? Did he go to his death as part of a collective ritual surrounded by chanting neighbours, or was he marched out by a handful of grim, practical people doing a job? Was this a one-off event, memorable precisely because it was unusual, or part of a recurring pattern, a seasonal offering, a punishment repeated over generations? How much choice did he have? Did the social world around him offer any real path to refusal? Did he believe in the necessity or justice of what was happening? Those are the questions the peat does not answer. Future methods might nibble at the edges. More refined isotopic baselines could tell us in greater detail where he spent different stages of his life, tightening or loosening the circle of home. Improved DNA recovery, if the chemistry of bog preservation ever yields a bit more, might connect him genetically to other individuals, suggesting kin groups, lineages, maybe even identifying clusters of related people who met similar ends. Comparative studies of many bog bodies, using standardized methods, might show clearer patterns in age, sex, health, trauma, and placement. Maybe then we'd be able to say, with more confidence, this subset looks like judicial execution, or this subset fits sacrificial logic. New experimental work on ropes and hanging combined with CT data might refine our understanding of exactly how his death unfolded second by second. But even in the best-case scenario, some gaps will stay. No scanner can reconstruct a law code never written down. No isotope ratio can tell you whether the people standing around that bog believed they were sending a soul to the gods, removing a dangerous person from society, or both at once. So, responsibly concluding here means holding two truths at the same time. We can say that Tollund Man was killed deliberately, by hanging in a bog that his community treated as a special kind of place. We can say his death sits at the crossroads of social control and sacred landscape, in a culture where fear of disorder and belief in unseen powers likely intertwined. And we can also say that beyond those contours, the story fractures into possibilities. The rope is clear, the motive is not, the body is intimate, the inner life is distant, the bog is generous with details and ruthless with meanings. What we're left with is not a solved mystery, but a set of boundaries inside which many stories could be true. It's inside those boundaries that our imagination starts to work, which is why, even after all these scans and samples and careful caveats, this one quiet man from a peat bog still refuses to let us go. Tollund Man grips us because he forces us to stare at a contradiction we're not very good at handling. He is at the same time impossibly close and permanently out of reach. On one level, he's just a man who woke up one morning not knowing it would be his last. He had a body that got hungry, knees that ached when it was damp, small everyday worries about weather and harvest and human relationships. He belonged to a community that knew his name, recognized his walk from far off, had opinions about his character. Then something happened, an accusation, a decree, a ritual decision, a crisis we can't see, and his ordinary life slammed into whatever forces were powerful enough to tighten that rope. In that collision, he stops being just a person and becomes something else. Evidence. A case study. A data point in Iron Age Europe. A specimen in a museum. We're caught between those two versions of him every time we look at his face. If he had decomposed like almost everyone else from his time, we would know nothing about him. He would be one more anonymous ancestor folded back into the soil, his story entirely absorbed into the collective past. Instead, the bog intervened. It froze one violent structured moment and refused to let it dissolve. The rest of his world has rotted away. His house, his tools, his voice, his relationships, the sound of his language, and the bog said, no. This death stays. That's part of what feels so eerie about the rope. Most ropes in history are temporary things. They fray, they rot, they're repurposed, they disappear. This one persists. Long after the hands that twisted the fibres are gone, long after the people who watch them knot it are gone, the rope is still doing its job. It is still the defining line around his neck. We don't just see that he died, we see how. The instrument of his death has outlived every story that was told to justify using it. That's a disturbing thought. Because ropes around necks are not confined to Iron Age bogs. They run through gallows in medieval towns, lynchings in more recent centuries, modern executions hidden behind prison walls. Seeing one so old, so intact, makes it hard not to think about all the others we can't see. The bog has preserved not only a man but a human habit, using controlled public death to solve social problems, to manage fear and belief. That might be another reason we can't quite look away. When we stand in front of Tollund Man, or look at his photograph, we're not just peering into a strange ancient world. We're looking at a mirror with the glass fogged and warped, but still reflective. Here is a community that drew a line between inside and outside, between those who belong and those who can be taken to the margin, literally to the wet, unstable edge of the landscape, and ended. That feels familiar. We may not throw people into peat bogs anymore, but we still argue about who counts as fully human in practice, whose suffering is acceptable, what sorts of violence we're willing to tolerate if we can convince ourselves it's necessary, legal, sacred, or inevitable. Tolland Man is compelling not just because he's old, but because his death sits in that uncomfortable overlap between they were so different from us and they were not different enough. He also hooks into something even simpler, curiosity about what else is out there. Every time peat cutters hit a skull or a femur, every time drainage work exposes a preserved shoe or a wooden trackway, we're reminded that wetlands are layered archives. They're not just habitats, they're time vaults. If one quiet corner of one Danish bog could hold a face this detailed, a rope this legible, how many other lives are lying a few meters down in other peatlands, their skin and hair and last meals waiting in the dark? Some will never be found. Drained bogs and industrial peat cutting have already destroyed countless sites. Others may surface tomorrow, or in a decade, or in a century, when someone digs a new ditch or sinks a foundation. That open possibility, that there are still intact human stories sealed under moss and water, is a powerful fuel for the imagination. It means that our picture of the past is not finished. It could be rewritten suddenly by the appearance of another face as expressive as Tolland Man's, but telling a very different story. A woman, a child, a person with clear signs of status or injury or disease that complicate our neat categories. We're living in a moment when archaeology and forensic science can do more with such finds than ever before. Tiny fragments can yield isotopes, microfossils, traces of proteins and lipids. We can reconstruct diets, movements, diseases, even seasonal patterns of stress written into bones and teeth. So each new bog body is not just a morbid curiosity. It's a chance to refine the story we're telling about how people lived, ruled, believed, and died on these wet frontiers. But alongside the analytical excitement, there's something quieter going on. Standing with Tolland Man, or even just thinking about him, you can feel the timeline between his world and ours shrink for a moment. He woke up under a grey northern sky. So do people today. He walked on damp ground that pulled at his shoes. So do people today. He belonged to a tangle of obligations and expectations strong enough that, when the rope came out, there was no easy way around it. So do people today. That's where the history label falls away and what's left is sympathy, or at least recognition. We will never know what he believed about his own death. We can only decide what we believe about it, standing here millennia later, in a world that still wrestles with violence, justice, and the need to make sense of endings. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this point, you're part of that work, trying to understand, not just consume the shock of a preserved body with a rope around its neck. So I'd like to hear from you. Within the limits of what we can responsibly conclude, where do you find yourself leaning? When you picture his final moments and the people around him, does it feel more like execution, more like sacrifice, or like something that doesn't quite fit either word? Share your theories in the comments, but do it with the same care we've tried to bring to his story. Curious, open, and respectful of the fact that real people were involved. And while you're down there, let me know where you're listening from. One of the strangest, most wonderful things about telling a story like this is knowing that a man who died in a Danish bog 2,400 years ago is now being thought about in living rooms and on bus rides and in bedrooms all over the world. If you found this deep dive into the past interesting, take a second to like the video. It helps other people find it. If you want more long, careful stories about the deep past, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if this kind of slow, detail-rich prehistory is your thing, there's a book full of prehistoric secrets waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com. It goes even further into the strange half-lit corners of our species' story. In the end, Tolland Man is one person among billions who have ever lived and died, but the bog refused to let his particular death vanish. As long as we keep looking at his face, asking questions about that rope, and arguing gently about what might have happened on that cold, wet day, his story is still unfolding, threaded between their time and ours, between peat and pixel, between a life that ended and a history that somehow does not.